thank Mass Humanities because this program is funded in part by Mass Humanities, which receives support from the Massachusetts Cultural Council and is an affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. I want to thank our board, the Wistariahurst Foundation, and specifically our member, Cynthia West, for all of her help coordinating and bringing Anthony Melting Tallow to our attention here. But most of all, I want to thank the artist, Anthony, for creating something so moving and beautiful in this space and coming here and being open to talk about his work with you. We're so grateful to have him here, and we hope you enjoy tonight's programming. And as soon as he's ready, he's going to take us on a journey. So thank you so much.
Hey everybody. So, welcome. Yeah, it's good to see everyone here is family, like I said. And so faces I haven't seen since this, really early in the pandemic. And so welcoming everybody back in. Lots of smiles. So yeah, I'm Anthony Melting Tallow of the Siksika Nation of present-day Southern Alberta, Canada. And I just want to welcome everybody to the exhibition. I prepared a series of slides that were talking a lot about the history, the context. So I wanted to build a story. But I feel like the show speaks for itself. So I'd like to invite everybody into the show and walk around, and I can expound more on what the pieces mean, what the context for the creation of each work means, and how it came to live with me, and how it came to speak through me to tell a story. So with that, welcome everybody, and if you'll follow me into the show. So the title of the show, really what the show is about is a collaboration, and it's a community effort. And part of what's at the heart of Indigenous cultures is community, family, kinship, relationship. In that spirit, the show came together through a lot of community efforts. I was at the center of the vision, but a lot of people were instrumental in making this exhibition possible. And this space wouldn't exist, the show wouldn't exist without the hard work of a lot of people. I have a lot of people to thank from the bottom of my heart for making this possible. And so really what it is, it's carrying prayer for all of us. It's carrying prayer for the community. It's looking back into our shared past, and also looking forward into relationships of revitalization, of recognition, of really reconciliation, and revisiting a lot of undertold stories, and setting the record straight, but in a way that fosters hope, because we are all here together. The elders say that we're here to mend the circle. And they always say that the United Nations of humanity exists here on Turtle Island. And that's part of what they foresaw us coming all together as a family of shared history to heal the future. So what that means is no one gets left behind. We're all here. Creator never placed us in a position where none of our gifts will go unused. So we all have a voice, even if it's in a role of witnessing. And that's another aspect of Indigenous culture, is coming together in ceremony, in gathering to witness. Witnessing births, deaths, marriages, milestones in a person's life, in a community's life, and in the collective. And even just being present as a witness is powerful. And as such, in the role of a witness, it's you're sharing where you're being invited into a shared experience. And what you take away from that experience is meant for you and you alone. So the experience speaks to you in your heart, in your spirit, and in your being. And what you take away from that experience is for you. So in that spirit, the show is titled Carrying Prayer, Reclamation, Remembrance, and Honor. And again, that's closing the circle. It's carrying prayer from our collective shared history, our past. And the honor is looking forward. So a lot of the work centers around the sacredness of material. And what's central to the show is the installation honoring a memorial honoring missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. This introduction to the show sheds light on honoring their voices, honoring their memories, carrying that with us. Because we're all in a position to, whether it's being aware of the problem, the issue, whether it's we're in a position to help or do what we can where we are, to just be aware of the issue, because the families of those people, Indigenous people that have gone missing, want their stories to get out there. They don't want the missing to be forgotten. They don't want the murdered sisters to be forgotten. And so anything that we can do to keep that message in our hearts and in our efforts going forward is what is at the heart of what they ask for. Not only justice, but and resources. They want education. And it's, again, relative to a lot of things in Indigenous country, it's an undertold story. And due to the decades-long hard work of a lot of grassroots individuals, families, from coast to coast to coast, all over Turtle Island, they're moving that story forward and making inroads into political organizations, legislation, inquiries that are uncovering the truth and getting to the heart of why a lot of these communities continue to be affected. The Department of Justice in Montana released a study in 2019 that showed over 80% of the missing and murdered Indigenous, which only make up 7% of the population of Montana, but yet they account for over a quarter of the missing. And 80% of the missing are under the age of 18. And that's just in the state of Montana alone. And one of the cofactors that have led to the epidemic are obviously poverty, childhood trauma, are very strongly correlated to a lot of what they've uncovered and that they've reported on. And they're leading the country in establishing databases, working closely with law enforcement, tribal police, the FBI, the CIA, federal and local governments to become more responsive when a woman is reported missing, so that they're dedicating those actual resources and those efforts to get the word out and bring her home with more promise. So a lot of what's the work around missing and murdered Indigenous women is looking at the model that Montana is setting up. And Montana is home to 13 Indigenous nations. And that Montana, the reason why I'm speaking of Montana is because as a Blackfoot Two-Spirit, our traditional territory was divided in half by the US-Canada boundary. And so I have extended family members, that are unfortunately part of, included in the rolls of the missing. So this whole exhibit exists. It just came together, and it came together in the most positive way possible. So the materials were gathered in a sacred way. Most specifically, what you'll see on the ground are boughs of cedar, and those are a healing medicine used throughout Indigenous nations throughout Turtle Island. And it's meant to, it holds our prayers. It's a healing medicine. It recognizes the spirits that are around us, that they come to us, and we can hold them in our hearts in a really sacred way, in a really honoring way. And when an eagle feather falls off a dancer's regalia at a gathering, a powwow, a ceremony, there are certain protocols that are in place to honor that feather that's fallen to earth. And you'll see replicas of eagle feathers that are lying on top of the cedar. And the cedar's holding those prayers. And it's healing. Each one of those eagle feathers represents a name, a person who, a mother, a daughter, an auntie, a cousin, a sister, a niece. So with that spirit, you're welcome to read a little more in depth about the spirit behind the show. And you're welcome to come on in, and I'll be happy to explain a lot of what you'll see. Oh.
Justin sends his love.
Hey, man.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Could you explain the different mediums that you work in and why you use those specific ones?
Sure. All my work is produced in-house, in editions no larger than editions of 3. And that's in keeping with my philosophy to keep a low carbon footprint and reduce the amount of materials that might go into the waste stream, either through the water stream or the waste stream. And I want to keep everything in-house so that I can have more creative control over the final output. And digital lends itself to more freedom for me to express and incorporate elements of that are important to my personal history and that are important to the history of my people, the Siksika Blackfoot, and incorporating their images, bringing them out of history for them to speak for themselves in a way that reclaims our voices. And there's, in a way, it's positioning what was originally a historic gaze and a gaze that a lot of the history sought to capture, because the thought then was that we're vanishing and that our population was shrinking to the point where the thought was that Native nations would no longer exist or be assimilated into the body politic of the United States and Canada specifically. And there were, for example, the residential school in Canada existed for 150 years, and 150,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children were forcibly sent there. And overwhelmingly, it was illegal for communities and parents and families not to send their children there. So it was in a lot of cases, over 400 residential schools, sanitariums, and hospitals housed Indigenous children, some whose parents had perished in like the 1912 flu epidemic. They became orphans and there was nowhere to house them, so they went to sanitariums. And unfortunately, in these institutions, the death rolls were so high by the 1920s, they stopped keeping records and started burying Indigenous children in mass graves, which are now being uncovered at the sites of former residential schools, sanitariums, and hospitals, and orphanages. in Canada. Beginning with the discovery of 215 bodies of children in a mass grave in the Kamloops Indian Residential School in the interior of British Columbia in 2020. Through ground penetrating radar, the Secwepemc Nation, whose traditional lands the Kamloops Indian Residential School is on, they were able to uncover that 215 children had been buried there and that existed outside of the official record. In 2015, the Canadian government released a report called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that showed on paper that over 4,000 children died, but the ground penetrating radar that's now being undertaken at the sites of former residential schools are showing that the numbers, one of the, there's an Indigenous justice member who headed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Senator Marie Sinclair, who said that he believes that the numbers are going to total somewhere around 100,000. Those were his personal estimates with the work that's being undertaken now. On my nation, the Siksika Nation, which is 60 miles east of Calgary on the Trans-Canada Highway, we had 2 residential schools that began in the late 1890s through the Anglican Church of Canada. It was funded by the Canadian government, and one of them was called the Old Sun Indian Residential School, which still stands today, and it's been repurposed to be the tribal college. Ground penetrating radar begins on the grounds very, very shortly. And then there's another residential school at the eastern edge of our reservation, and that work will begin soon. Because we've grown up with stories about my father's generation attending school and having to dig graves for their classmates. And often they're stories because they weren't part of the Truth and Reconciliation's findings, that they weren't recorded. So there are stories that have existed within the residential school survivors that speak of a lot of these lost children. And so it's not an easy history to talk about. I think it's one that we're ready to hear now as part of an effort to move forward in a spirit of healing, because not only Indigenous people need to engage in the act of healing, I think because it's a part of our shared history that the time for healing and the time for survivor stories, the time for us to reach out and tell these undertold stories that of our survival. And that's part of our resilience. That's part of why we're still here. That's part of why we have some personal responsibility, at least for myself, to tell the story as a survivor. I am a product of the residential school. Even though I never set foot inside an institution, I nevertheless inherited those intergenerational epigenetic traumas that were carried through the bloodline and implanted in me and my siblings, because what we ended up experiencing are what they now call the 60s scoop. And that context involved over 20,000 Indigenous children of residential school survivors, and ending up in the foster care system, ended up being adopted, in some cases as far away as New Zealand. There was a program that sprung out of Manitoba in Winnipeg and Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, where it was called AIM, Adopt an Indian or Métis, in the 60s. going through the 70s, they'd advertise adoption for Indigenous and Métis children in the newspaper. And often the social workers were given production awards for the most children adopted out under that program. And a lot of the survivors of the 60s scoop, some of them didn't find out that they were part of that legacy until their adoptive parents perhaps passed away and they received the records that they were adopted and where they were from. And even during that period of the 60s and 70s, it was illegal for adoptive parents to share that information with Indigenous or Métis children that they adopted. It would, by law, they could face consequences if they shared that information about their birth parents, their birth community, the village, reservation, or community that they had been adopted out of. So what this all means is as part of a legacy of trauma, there's also a responsibility to hold those stories and share them in a way that brings in healing. Because, there's many aspects of Indigenous modern contemporary experience that are still informed and by these legacies. And in a lot of cases, this is still ongoing. It hasn't relented because 52% of children in foster care in Canada alone are Indigenous. And both in Canada and the United States, more Indigenous children are in care or adopted or unhoused, homeless, than ever were at the height of the boarding school era in the United States or the residential school system in Canada. So there are many stories that reflect my own that are still echoing through the lives of Indigenous children today. So as Indigenous people, we find each other. We build community. I'm not from here. This is not my traditional territory. My traditional territory is thousands of miles to the west, modern day Treaty 7, and our Blackfeet Nation, which exists near Glacier National Park in northwestern Montana. I had to find my own journey of survival and survivance by coming here to so-called New England in order to survive. I lost two brothers, my younger brother Gabriel in 2012. He was unhoused, addicted, lost to the streets. His body was found on a bench by volunteers preparing for the annual Calgary Stampede in July of 2012. And there was no autopsy, there was nothing in the paper. And a while later, I lost my older brother, Lorne, and he was the second homicide in Vancouver, the downtown east side Skid Row in 2015. And I felt that if I would have stayed on my home territory, in the context in which I found myself, that I would be easily counted among that very same outcome. So coming here, I found family, I found community, I found people that are very supportive about making this vision possible. And part of my story is the resilience you can see in the color around you. It's a healing, ultimately it's a healing show, and it's a show about hope. And that as hard to hear as these stories are, and sometimes hard to tell, they're necessary. And that's the only way we're gonna go together forward, is sharing these stories and bringing that story forward in an individual way, in a powerful way, in a meaningful way, even if you sit very privately with the realities that I'm sharing just in this context. And
I find there's a really interesting balance in your artwork between joy and anxiety that I find really interesting and captivating. Like even if you look at this piece here and you see the negative image and you see the colors that are being used, there's like this balance here that's really beautiful. And I think everything that you're saying is really mimicked in your artwork, which I really enjoy. And I really appreciate, there's that balance of hope, but also reality of what's happened and what's still happening that I think is really interesting.
yeah, I'd like to actually frame the context for indigeneity and that spirit of looking forward. I mean, while we're looking back, the colors look forward into the future. They're hopeful, they're optimistic, they're engaging, and that feels like it might end for the viewer. And the longer you look, the more questions will arise in your mind with the hope that you would look at something that's history has framed, and then it's reframed, but through an Indigenous perspective. And with respect to this particular image, this is after one of the first important documentarians in American photography, Edward Muybridge. And he did multiple famous movement studies. And there are stories around this image that he wanted to document the disappearance of the American buffalo because it was so tied in with the fate of Indigenous nations and the thought at the time that we better document this quick before it disappears. And the thought was that Indigenous nations were going to follow the buffalo into eternity, essentially, as extinct species. So this is showing that we're still here, we're resilient, we have things to say, and this is also, it was also a love affair for me to engage in because I have a very personal connection to the buffalo as part of my ancient, and I'm just drawn to the story of the buffalo itself. And they're majestic beings, and they know just as much about us as we do about them. And they are a part of my people. And so it was a way to honor and look back and take what images that I could take from history and move forward with that.
Yeah. Somebody else have any questions? I think the pixelated sitting pool is another one that's just really wonderfully trying to reframe the perspective. It's such a great piece. Would you mind talking about that one a little bit?
The Sitting Bull?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, again, color is important here. The context behind the photograph was one that Sitting Bull was a very close personal friend with the photographer. And the photographer invited him to the studio and encouraged Sitting Bull to wear what he wanted. And this was a way that Sitting Bull took advantage of to take ownership back of his own image. Because at the time of this photograph, he was a prisoner of war, essentially. After the Battle of Little Bighorn, where the combined forces of Cheyenne, the Sioux, Lakota nations defeated the US Army on the battlefield. And Sitting Bull knew that he was going to be persecuted and made an example of when he was captured. So following that battle, he took our Chief Crowfoot up on his offer to seek refuge and sanctuary amongst our people, the Siksika Blackfoot in Canada, across the so-called Medicine Line. And it was called the Medicine Line because tribes that were being pursued by the US Army, they noticed that the US Army stopped at this imaginary boundary while they fled. So it was a medicine line. It was like this imaginary line, because Indigenous people, there weren't strict defined boundaries as exist today. So Sitting Bull took our chief Crowfoot up on his offer to seek sanctuary amongst our people in order to escape persecution by what he knew would be a vengeful government and U.S. Army. As a thank you, Sitting Bull gave the Blackfoot the protocol and the privilege to wear the backward-facing Sioux eagle feather headdress, the use of the thunder drum, and the songs and the protocols that go along with that. And he named his firstborn son after our chief Crowfoot. So Sitting Bull his first son was named after our chief. Because this was at a time of transition where we had just asked the Dominion of Canada that only existed in the East for their help to drive the whiskey traders out of our territory. And they were decimating us culturally. A lot of us were addicted to alcohol. A lot of murders were taking place. Our culture was experiencing this vast upheaval because smallpox decimated us before we ever saw an influx of settlers. A trading party came in, and 2 individuals as part of that trading party were knowingly sent in carrying smallpox. And because we had this fearsome reputation of being, quote, haughty and having no use for the white man, unquote, by people who had encountered or wanted to stay clear of Blackfoot country. And even Lewis and Clark had a skirmish with, they had heard stories, and they came across a group of young Blackfoot men who were out on a horse raiding. They were just encountering each other at the southern end of our territory. And the outcome of that encounter ended in the killing of 2 young Blackfoot men. When Lewis and Clark woke up in the morning, and the Blackfoot men were in the process of stealing their horses. And so Lewis and Clark party acted quick to flee for 40 hours straight, because they understood that the Blackfoot had such a fearsome reputation that they would be pursued as far as they could be. So they fled day and night. So we had this fearsome reputation, and the only way that they knew to impact us was essentially through germ warfare. And so that trading party was sent in with blankets, cast iron kettles, and traded knowing that they would spread smallpox, which meant that 8 out of 10 of us died. And you could imagine that 8 out of 10 of everyone you knew suddenly passed away. And so that grief, and so many people died that there were no way to perform burial rites, ceremony for everybody. So people were just essentially left where they had fallen. And the grief that overtook our communities was such that people turned to the first available thing that was offered, which was alcohol. So we were beholden to the Dominion of Canada, which brought in the Royal-Mounted Canadian Police to our territory to drive the whiskey traders back into the United States. And because of that, when Sitting Bull was arranging all of the nations to fight the 7th Cavalry, he approached our chief, and our chief said, I made peace. I made a peace treaty. I can't violate that. And so the offer was made, you can seek sanctuary amongst us. So this is a portrait of looking back and honoring the role of Sitting Bull in the relationship that we had that was pre-existing. And it's a way of honoring the fact that Sitting Bull made efforts to reclaim his own image. Because similar to another persecuted Indigenous warrior, Geronimo was only paid pennies for his image. which was put on postcards, posters, photographs that were sold, and the US government often just kept that profit. And Sitting Bull had that same experience where his image was used in ways that he had no control over. So this is one way that he took control of his own image back. And so, as a descendant of Blackfoot people honoring the Sioux and our role, our pre-existing role, I chose to bring that portrait of him forward in a modern way, referencing artists that have popularized and really changed the landscape of modern art, like Warhol, Andy Warhol. Similar to this portrait of my great-great-grandfather, Many Turning Robes, using the colors and bringing a vitality to that, such an intense gaze, that there's a lot behind those eyes and that expression that has a lot to say about. This was in 1903, and he was a prominent leader amongst the Blackfoot. And everything that he's adorned with in that photograph has such deep meaning and history. The Hudson's Bay blanket, the capote that was made out of a trade item that he's wearing. So he took a leadership role to set in motion a lot of the things that benefited us today. He made a lot of sacrifices as a leader in order to make sure that our people would go forward with, in his eyes, the residential school was, he was sold a bill of goods by the church and the government that it was the way of the future, and giving up the nomadic way of life and settling down and being made farmers, growers of wheat, sugar beets, turnips. He embraced the future, not knowing the exact legacies of what were to come out of the residential school or other further historic relationships with the Canadian government. So he did his best, and someone that I look back in history, and I look into his eyes, and I hope that I'm doing him proud. So I look back, see that legacy that he gave to me. So these are portraits of honor, and color and vibrancy and life. And
yeah, I've heard other artists talk about there's so much color with a lot of their cultures, and so when they see these black and white images as being like the standard for how they're represented, especially like Edward Curtis and artists like that, where they're like, this is not correct. Like, we want to celebrate, we want to include color. So when I see your artwork, you can't help but feel this like joy that comes from the colors that you use. It's wonderful.
yeah, thank you. Hey, good to see you.
Does anybody else have any questions or comments for Anthony? I think you've done such a great job explaining everything. I mean, if there's anything else you'd like to say, I think we've got about 15 minutes left.
Okay.
Less, but
one of the things that I mean, we've been married for a while. One of the works that I heard him explain to somebody else, and I didn't realize, was the fractured plate over there on the wall, the one in the shape of a wing. Could you explain?
Yeah.
Because like I said, I didn't know about it until he explained it to somebody else. But
So this is an image. It's called Fractured Flight, and it's a very, it's gotten a lot of attention. It's now in the, there's only edition of, this is one of 3, and the first went to the Forbes Library's permanent collection in Northampton. So I'm very proud of that fact, that the story behind his creation is it's a 2-dimensional representation that approximates a 3D wing made of shale fragments. And what that means in a contemporary aspect relative to my nation is that beginning in the late 80s and the early 1990s, we didn't have the capital to develop the oil, natural gas, and coal reserves under our land. And so we contracted with outside extractive industries to tap wells and to fracture the land deep under the soil to get at these petrochemical reserves. In terms of reservation land, our nation, the Siksika Nation, 60 miles east of Calgary, is the second largest reservation in Canada. And so we had a land base to have these extractive industries before we knew how sick people were starting to get once this industry was in full force on our reservation, extracting these petrochemicals out of the earth. People started to get sick from the water, bathing, showering, washing their clothes, drinking it every day. The eagle is a sacred being because they fly the highest and they see everything below on the earth, which means that our good thoughts go to the eagle, which he carries to the ancestors and to Creator. Our prayers are grounded. This is a fractured flight. They can't, they try to rise, but they're inhibited because our annual gathering of Sundance every August takes place over the week, and people volunteer themselves to sacrifice and fast and make a physical sacrifice of their bodies, and they dance and they pray and they do ceremony for a week, and they end that fast with a drink of water. And we can't drink the water straight out of the ground like we used to now. They have to bring in bottled water. So, we're very much impacted by, we were very, very much wanting to be stewards of our own future, which is why our leadership at the time latched so heavily onto the economy of what the present-day province of Alberta is tied into. It's called the Houston of the North, and the oil is all landlocked. You might have heard of the tar sands near Fort McMurray, Alberta. I think it's 350 kilometers northeast of Edmonton, the capital of our province. So it's a landlocked oil reserve. And a lot of that impetus for development came out of subsistence in the 1920s, where men just traveled the reserve and they dug up coal right out of the ground, and coal was one of the fuels to heat homes, and before the widespread advent of electric heat. So this mindset existed that we will take advantage of these petrochemical resources before we knew how ill it would make us, even though we knew that the original agreements in the treaty said there should be no digging below the depth of a plow. Because that wisdom held truth that what's under there should stay under there. And unfortunately, we found out to our horror that this was a very real reality for us. And so the eagle wing, it can't fly. The prayers have a much harder time rising on the eagle's wing to Creator what's in our hearts. And it makes those traditional efforts that much more challenging. So this is what this piece speaks to. It's like a monument. It's of the earth, and so that's what the truth behind what the image speaks about. So there's a lot of what you see around you has very real implications and very real consequences and legacies that come out of the image that we can take note of. They're almost like modern, they're like our creations, they're part of our creation stories. You know, we can't deny the choices that we've made, but we can grow from the knowledge of the choices that we've made. And so our nation is very much trying to remediate and rectify a lot of the earlier decisions that were made with the hopes that it would better the nation. And they're looking at water remediation. They've recently gotten back water rights. There was a dam that was placed on our river without our consent. And so we've recently got that back. So we're trying to do things that will revitalize the watershed and take care of and be more conscious stewards of what we're responsible, what we're caretaking. So this is part of acknowledging that, like looking at the less pleasant aspects of where we find ourselves and what survival has meant and the responses to try to, like a lot of what my great-great-grandfather, Minnie Turning Robe, set in place, that he had hoped for the future, thinking ahead to what might benefit future generations. And unfortunately, a lot of those decisions aren't always, don't turn out in the best possible way that you had in your heart hoped for. So.
Well, thank you so much, Anthony. That's about time. People want to spend the last 5 minutes kind of looking at everything else and taking it all in. We greatly appreciate you coming here and talking about your art tonight, and it's absolutely beautiful. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so proud.